The room went silent. Not the kind of silence that falls between words, but the kind that crushes air from lungs, that makes hearts skip beats, that turns grown men into statues. In the depths of the Kriegsmarine headquarters in Berlin, late autumn 1943, an intelligence officer stood frozen, a decoded message trembling in his hands. The paper was thin, ordinary, the kind that should have carried routine reports about convoy movements or weather patterns over the Atlantic. But the words typed across it were anything but ordinary. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, the man who had promised Hitler he would strangle Britain's lifelines across the ocean, watched as his officer's face drained of color. "Speak," Dönitz commanded, though something in his chest already knew this would be bad. The officer's voice came out as barely a whisper, each word fighting to exist. "The Americans, Herr Admiral. They're launching a new ship." He paused, swallowed hard, then forced out the impossible truth. "Every single day." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Every officer in the room turned, their movements slow, mechanical, as if moving too quickly might make the statement real. Captain Werner Hartmann, veteran of 37 Atlantic patrols, let out a sharp laugh, the kind that escapes when the mind refuses to process reality. "Impossible," he spat. "Propaganda. American lies meant to." But the intelligence officer was already shaking his head, pulling more papers from his briefcase, photographs taken by agents in American ports, shipping manifests stolen from dockworkers, testimonies from captured merchant sailors. The evidence mounted on the table like an avalanche of truth. Ships rolling off assembly lines faster than cars. Welders working through the night under stadium lights. Women, children, anyone with working hands, all building, always building. The ocean itself was being colonized by American steel. Don't let history be forgotten. Subscribe now so more people hear the story. Dönitz picked up one photograph with steady hands, though his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. It showed the Kaiser shipyard in Richmond, California, taken from a hillside by a German agent posing as a bird watcher. In the image, 4 Liberty ships sat in various stages of completion, but that wasn't what made his blood run cold. It was the date stamps on the construction markers, barely visible but unmistakable through the magnification lens. Ship number 1, keel laid October 15th. Ship number 2, keel laid October 16th. Ship number 3, October 17th. The dates marched forward like tombstones, each one exactly 24 hours apart. "This cannot be real," Admiral Dönitz said, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. He was talking to himself now, to the universe, to whatever God might be listening. "No nation can build ships this fast. The steel alone would take months to forge, the engines would need—" The intelligence officer interrupted, something he would never have dared do under normal circumstances. "They've changed everything, Herr Admiral. Assembly lines, prefabrication. They build the ships in pieces across the entire country, then put them together like toys." The word toys hung in the air, obscene in its simplicity. These weren't toys. They were 10,000-ton cargo vessels, each one capable of carrying enough supplies to feed a division for months, enough ammunition to level a city, enough fuel to keep 100 tanks rolling toward Berlin. And the Americans were building them faster than Germany could build trucks. In U-boat pens along the French coast, submarine crews were already whispering about what they'd seen through their periscopes. Convoys that stretched beyond the horizon, too many ships to count, let alone attack. Young Wilhelm Muller, barely 19, on his first patrol as a torpedo operator, had written to his mother, "The ocean has turned gray with American steel. We fired 6 torpedoes yesterday. We sank 2 ships. This morning, I counted 40 more on the horizon. Where do they all come from, Mother? It's as if the sea itself is giving birth to them." Meanwhile, 3,000 miles away in the shipyards of Portland, Oregon, a different kind of letter was being written. Margaret O'Brien, her hands still black with welding burns, her hair tied back under a starred bandana, wrote to her husband fighting in Italy, "Danny, you wouldn't believe what we did today. We launched the Francis Scott Key. Start to finish in 4 days, 15 hours, and 26 minutes. For days, Danny, Mr. Kaiser himself came down to shake our hands. The girl next to me, Betty, she's 17, never held a welding torch before Pearl Harbor. Today, she sealed the hull plates on her 42nd ship. 42nd. I'm on my 38th. We've got a competition going. The men returning from injuries, they can't believe it. One said we're building ships faster than the Germans can sink them. Is that true, Danny? Are we really winning? The truth was worse than even Danny could have known. In the U-boat command bunkers, the mathematics of destruction had become a nightmare that repeated every morning with the intelligence reports. Captain Otto Kretschmer, Germany's most celebrated U-boat ace, had done the calculations himself, refusing to believe his staff officers. He sat at his desk with a bottle of schnapps, running the numbers again and again, hoping each time for a different answer. Before the Americans entered the war, German U-boats needed to sink 600,000 tons of shipping per month to strangle Britain. They'd nearly done it in 1941, coming within a whisper of forcing Churchill to his knees. But now the Americans were building 140 ships per month. Not per year, per month. Each Liberty ship displaced 14,245 tons. That meant Kretschmer's pencil stopped moving. It meant the Americans were adding 2 million tons of shipping every single month. His U-boats would need to sink 3 ships every single day just to break even. And that assumed no British construction, no repairs to damaged vessels, no Canadian shipyards, no contribution from the other allies. Just to match American production alone would require tripling his current fleet's effectiveness. The pencil snapped in his fingers. Back in Berlin, the reverberations of this revelation were spreading through the command structure like cracks in ice. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel found the report on his desk marked with the highest classification, Extremer Geheimnis, beyond secret. He read it 3 times, each reading making his chest tighter. He'd seen the production figures from German shipyards. The pride of the Reich could manage perhaps 1 major vessel per month, maybe 2 if they pushed their workers to collapse. The Americans were launching heavy cruisers at a rate that exceeded Germany's ability to produce patrol boats. But it wasn't just the ships, it was what the ships meant. If America could build vessels this fast, what else could they build? Tanks? Aircraft? Bullets? The report included an intercepted broadcast from American radio, a program called Music for Defense Workers. The announcer's voice was cheerful, almost casual. And remember, folks, every rivet you drive is a nail in Hitler's coffin. Speaking of which, the Richmond yards just announced they're hiring another 10,000 workers for the night shift. 10,000. If you can hold a wrench, Uncle Sam needs you. 10,000 workers. For one shipyard. For the night shift alone. General Alfred Jodl did his own calculations in the margin of his copy. If each American shipyard employed 30,000 workers across all shifts, and intelligence suggested there were now 18 major shipyards operating at full capacity, that meant over 500,000 Americans were building ships. Germany's entire naval construction workforce numbered fewer than 80,000, and they were already working 20-hour shifts, sustained by methamphetamine pills that left them shaking and hallucinating. The German workers were collapsing at their stations, dying of exhaustion, while American workers were apparently broadcasting music programs and hiring by the tens of thousands. He thought of his nephew, Hans, working in the Kiel shipyards. The boy's last letter had mentioned that they'd run out of quality steel and were melting down railroad tracks to patch submarine hulls. The Americans, according to intelligence, had just opened 2 new steel mills dedicated exclusively to shipbuilding, each one larger than Germany's entire Ruhr Valley complex. The contrast was becoming obscene. In Hamburg's Blohm and Voss shipyard, workers were dismantling half-finished destroyers to salvage steel for U-boats, prioritizing what they could actually complete. Foreman Klaus Richter wrote in his journal, "Today we received orders to strip the armor plating from the Seydlitz, a battleship reduced to scrap because we have no materials to finish her." The men wept as they took her apart. Grown men who'd survived the Eastern Front, crying over steel plates. Meanwhile, Radio Berlin tells us we're winning. If we're winning, why are we eating our own ships? At the exact same moment, in the Bath Iron Works in Maine, a timer rang out across the yard. Another Liberty ship was ready for launch. The workers had given her a nickname, Fräulein Führer, painted in mock German script on her bow. She was the yard's 5th ship that month, and it was only the 15th of November. The workers were already prepping the next hull. Someone had hung a banner over the construction bay, "Every ship a bullet. Make them count." Support this work so the truth continues to reach people, and make sure you're subscribed. But the real shock wasn't just the speed, it was the method. German naval engineers, when they finally understood how the Americans were doing it, refused to believe it could work. Ships had always been built like cathedrals, each one a unique masterpiece, crafted by skilled artisans over months or years. The very idea of mass production for something as complex as an ocean-going vessel seemed like madness. Yet the Americans had done something unprecedented. They turned shipbuilding into factory work. In the Richmond shipyards, workers didn't need to be master craftsmen. They needed to know one job, one task, repeated endlessly. A 16-year-old girl could be taught to weld a specific seam in 2 days. A grandmother could learn to rivet deck plates in an afternoon. The ship grew around them like a living thing, fed by an endless stream of prefabricated parts that arrived by train from places the workers had never heard of. Engine mounts from Denver, propeller shafts from Detroit, navigation equipment from Chicago. The pieces fit together like a massive jigsaw puzzle, each one standardized, interchangeable, perfect. Heinrich Lehmann Willenbrock, captain of U-96, had seen the future through his periscope and knew Germany had already lost. He wrote in his war diary, knowing it would likely be read by intelligence officers, May 1943, surfaced at dawn to recharge batteries. Convoy HX 237 on the horizon, counted 40 vessels at first light. By full dawn, count exceeded 70. By noon, still counting. American flags on everything that floats. Some ships so new the paint isn't dry. One vessel still had construction scaffolding on its bridge. They're sailing them straight from the shipyard to the war. God help us. They don't even wait for the paint to dry. What he didn't write, what he couldn't bring himself to commit to paper, was what his radio operator had intercepted. American commercial radio playing jazz music, advertisements for Coca-Cola, comedy programs. They were building a ship a day and broadcasting comedy. Germany was melting church bells for bronze bearings while America was laughing. The scale defied comprehension. Joseph Goebbels, the master of propaganda, found himself in the impossible position of trying to spin numbers that wouldn't add up no matter how creatively he arranged them. He sat in his office with reports spread across his desk like tarot cards predicting doom. One Liberty ship required 250,000 parts. The Americans were building 365 per year. That meant they were manufacturing, shipping, and assembling 91 million ship parts annually. Just the welding alone required 37 miles of seam per ship. Multiply that by daily production. The Americans were welding enough steel every single day to build a fence from Berlin to Hamburg. The workforce numbers were even more staggering. Intelligence reported that American shipyard workers were putting in 50-hour weeks. Not the 90-hour death marches of German workers, but sustainable, productive hours. They had cafeterias serving hot meals, medical clinics on site, even childcare facilities so mothers could work. One intercepted letter from a worker in the Bethlehem Fairfield shipyard read, "The money is so good, Martha. I bought us a refrigerator. A refrigerator. While building destroyers. Can you imagine?" Goebbels couldn't imagine. In Germany, workers were paying a month's wages for a kilogram of black market butter. His propaganda films showed happy German workers building the instruments of victory, but the reality was skeletal men collapsing at their lathes, women fainting from hunger at their welding stations. He received a report that made him close his eyes in despair. American shipyards had just instituted something called swing shift dancing, entertainment for workers between shifts. They were literally dancing while they outproduced the entire Axis alliance. How could he possibly spin this? How could he tell the German people that their enemies were building more in recreation time than Germany could manage in desperation? The numbers became an obsession in German high command. Every morning, fresh intelligence arrived, each report more impossible than the last. The SS Patrick Henry, conceived to combat in 4 days, 12 hours. The SS Robert E. Peary, Kiel to commission in 4 days, 15.5 hours. These weren't emergency measures or special demonstrations. This was routine. Admiral Erich Raeder, former head of the Kriegsmarine, sat in forced retirement, reading these reports with the fascination of a man watching his own execution being planned. He'd once told Hitler that Germany would need a decade to build a fleet capable of challenging the Allies. The Americans had built that fleet in 18 months, and they were still accelerating. The latest intelligence suggested they were experimenting with something called batch production, building 10 identical ships simultaneously, with specialized teams rotating between them. If successful, they'd be launching 10 ships in the time it previously took to build one. In the Atlantic, the reality was becoming undeniable. U-boat crews started reporting something that hadn't happened since the war began. Empty torpedo tubes with no targets worth pursuing. Not because there were no ships, but because there were too many. Attacking a convoy had become like trying to empty the ocean with a bucket. Lieutenant Commander Eric Top of U-552 made a decision that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. He let a convoy pass without attacking. In his report, he wrote, Convoys E-127, estimated 100-plus vessels. Escort strength minimal. Perfect attack conditions. Torpedoes remaining. 6. Rationale for non-engagement. Mathematical futility. 6 torpedoes against 100 ships equals 0.006% impact on enemy capacity. Fuel expended returning to base for reload. Significant. Probable replacement rate of destroyed vessels by enemy. Instantaneous. Conclusion. Tactical victory achieves strategic nothing. The report was never filed. Top burned it and told his crew they'd seen nothing. But word spread through the U-boat fleet anyway, whispered in the diesel-scented darkness. The sea war was over, and Germany had lost. The human cost was becoming visible in ways that couldn't be hidden. In Hamburg, Wilhelmshaven, Kiel, the great ports of Germany, families waited for U-boats that would never return. The submarines were being hunted now by ships that hadn't existed 6 months ago, tracked by radar mounted on vessels so new the instruction manuals were still being written. American destroyer escorts were rolling off the production lines at a rate of 1 every 3 days, each one purpose-built to kill submarines. They had names like USS England and USS Buckley, and they hunted in packs, guided by intelligence from ships Germany didn't even know existed. Escort carriers. Tiny aircraft carriers built on Liberty ship hulls, launching submarine hunting aircraft in the middle of the Atlantic where no planes should be. Commander Herbert Schulze, veteran of 40 patrols, made his last entry in the War Diary of U-437 on November 18, 1943. Surfaced for battery charge 200 hours. Horizon lit with ship lights. Counted 27 vessels before diving. Radio operator reports American broadcast. Oakland shipyard launches its 500th vessel today. Workers celebrate with champagne donated by Hollywood star Rita Hayworth. 500 ships. 1 shipyard. My crew asks me if we can win. I tell them yes. They know I'm lying. I know they know. We pretend together. What else can we do? We are dead men hunting ghost ships that multiply in the night. The Americans aren't just winning. They're not even trying hard. This isn't war anymore. It's mathematics, and we're on the wrong side of the equation. The equation was indeed brutal in its simplicity. For every ton of shipping the U-boats managed to sink, the Americans were building 3 tons to replace it. But even that didn't capture the full scope of the disaster. The Liberty ships weren't just cargo vessels. They were symbols of a production capacity that defied imagination. If America could standardize and mass-produce something as complex as a ship, what couldn't they build? The answer was already appearing on other fronts. B-24 bombers were rolling out of Willow Run at 1 per hour. 24 heavy bombers every single day from one factory. Sherman tanks were being produced at a rate that meant America built more tanks in a month than Germany managed in a quarter. Artillery shells, bullets, uniforms, boots, rations, everything was being produced in quantities that transformed war from a contest of courage to a problem of logistics. And America had solved logistics. In the Reich Chancellery, Hitler refused to read the naval reports anymore. When Admiral Dönitz tried to explain the situation, the Führer screamed that it was defeatist thinking, that German will would overcome American steel. But even Hitler's architect, Albert Speer, knew the truth. He'd done his own analysis, and the conclusions were inescapable. In his private notes, discovered after the war, he wrote, "The American production system represents something new in human history. They have eliminated craftsmanship and replaced it with process. They have removed the human element and replaced it with system. A grandmother in Iowa can build part of a ship. A child in Texas can assemble bomber components. They have democratized war production to such an extent that their entire nation has become a single vast factory. We are fighting the entire American population. Every man, woman, and child is a soldier in their production army. How do you defeat a nation where every citizen is armed with a welding torch? Subscribe so these forbidden stories don't vanish again." The stories from the shipyards themselves revealed the human dimension of this industrial miracle. In Richmond, California, a worker named James Thompson wrote to his son, "Today I met a woman, must have been 70 years old, installing electrical systems in the engine room. Her husband died at Pearl Harbor. She said every wire she connects is a message to Tojo. She's installed wiring in 90 ships. 90! She keeps count, has all the names written in a notebook. She says she won't stop until she hits 100. The foreman tried to give her lighter duty, afraid she'll collapse. She told him she'll collapse when Hitler does, not before." Meanwhile, in the Krupp factories in Essen, German workers were literally dying at their posts. The amphetamine pills that kept them working 20-hour shifts were destroying their hearts. One report noted that more workers were dying from exhaustion than from Allied bombing. They were being worked to death trying to match a production rate that American workers achieved while taking lunch breaks. The technology gap was becoming a chasm. German engineers prided themselves on building the finest machines in the world. Each U-boat was a masterpiece of engineering, each component precisely machined, perfectly fitted. But perfection took time. The Type 7 U-boat required 6 months to build, and that was when materials were available. The Americans had abandoned perfection for sufficiency. Their Liberty ships were ugly, simple, and crude by German standards. German naval officers mocked them as Kaiser's coffins, predicting they'd break apart in heavy seas. Some did. It didn't matter. For every Liberty ship that failed, 10 more were already at sea. The Americans had discovered something revolutionary. In total war, quantity had a quality all its own. 100 adequate ships were infinitely more valuable than 10 perfect ones. Captain Ernst Lehmann of U-731 experienced this firsthand. On patrol in March 1943, he'd stalked Convoy HX-228, positioning himself perfectly for an attack run. Through his periscope, he watched a Liberty ship struggle in heavy seas, its welded hull visibly flexing with each wave. "Amateur construction," he'd muttered to his first officer. "American trash." He fired 2 torpedoes, both perfect hits. The Liberty ship SS Daniel Webster broke in half and sank in 12 minutes. Lehmann felt the familiar satisfaction of a kill, the pride of German engineering triumphing over American mass production. 6 hours later, still trailing the convoy, he counted the ships again. The convoy had been joined by 5 new vessels. 5 ships had materialized from the western horizon in the time it took him to reload his torpedo tubes. He stared through the periscope in disbelief. One of the new ships was so fresh from the yard that crew members were still painting her hull number. They were literally finishing the ship while sailing to war. The propaganda war became increasingly difficult for Germany. While Goebbels crafted elaborate deceptions about wonder weapons and final victories, American propaganda was devastatingly simple. They just reported their production numbers. Radio broadcasts aimed at German forces didn't need to lie or exaggerate. This week, American shipyards launched 28 new vessels. Next week, we expect 30. The numbers themselves were weapons, each announcement another blow to German morale. U-boat crews began calling them funeral counts, not of ships sunk, but of hopes destroyed. In occupied France, German sailors would gather around hidden radios to hear the latest figures. the way condemned men might count the steps of approaching guards. 29 ships this week, 31 the next, 35. The numbers never went down. But perhaps the most devastating revelation came from an unexpected source. In August 1943, a German spy in the Panama Canal sent a coded message that reached Berlin after a 2-week journey through neutral countries. The message was brief: canal operating at capacity. Average daily transit, 41 vessels. 60% flying American flags. New ships still have yard numbers, no names. Americans not bothering to name them anymore. Just numbers, like ammunition. The implications were staggering. Ships were being produced so fast they weren't even being properly christened. They were ammunition, nothing more. Disposable, replaceable, infinite. Admiral Dönitz made one last desperate attempt to convey the situation to Hitler. In a private meeting in December 1943, he brought photographs, charts, and testimonies. He showed Hitler a picture taken by a reconnaissance aircraft. An American convoy stretching literally beyond the horizon, over 200 ships in perfect formation. Hitler's response was to order more U-boats built. When Dönitz explained they had no steel, no workers, no fuel for training, Hitler screamed about defeatism and threatened to replace him. But as Dönitz left the meeting, Hitler's secretary heard the Führer say quietly, almost to himself, "1 ship a day. How is such a thing possible?" Even in his delusions, reality was beginning to intrude. The American production miracle had another dimension that German intelligence only gradually understood. It wasn't just ships, it was the entire support infrastructure. For every Liberty ship launched, there were dozens of supporting vessels. Tankers, escort ships, repair vessels, ammunition ships, hospital ships. The Americans were building entire floating cities, complete naval infrastructures that could operate independently for months. They'd created something unprecedented. A truly global naval force, capable of projecting power to any ocean on Earth simultaneously. German U-boats, meanwhile, were being forced to operate from fewer and fewer bases as Allied bombing intensified. The concrete U-boat pens that had seemed impregnable were becoming tombs, trapping submarines that had nowhere safe to go. The human stories continued to accumulate like evidence in a trial Germany had already lost. In the Mare Island shipyard in California, a team of women welders had developed a competition they called Racing the Reich. They'd post German production figures on a board. When intelligence reported Germany had launched a new U-boat, they'd work extra shifts until they'd built enough ship tonnage to equal 10 submarines. They usually managed it in 3 days. One of them, Dorothy Patterson, wrote to her local newspaper, "Every rivet I drive is for my brother on the USS Houston. Every plate I weld is armor for boys I'll never meet. We're not just building ships. We're building a bridge for our soldiers to walk home on." Her team would go on to work on 127 vessels before the war's end. Meanwhile, in the U-boat base at Lorient, supplies were running so low that submarines were going to sea with half their normal food rations. Fresh vegetables were a memory. Meat was reserved for boats about to sail. The proud U-boat arm, which had once been promised the best of everything, was now subsisting on synthetic bread and turnip soup. One engineer wrote, "The Americans sink our boats with ships built by grandmothers eating steaks. We try to fight back with starving boys in iron coffins. This is not war. This is mathematics mocking human courage." The mathematics were indeed merciless. By late 1943, the Americans were producing more ship tonnage in a week than the entire German Navy possessed at the start of the war. The psychological impact on German naval leadership was profound. Rear Admiral Hans-Georg von Friedberg, responsible for U-boat operations, began showing signs of severe depression. His staff reported finding him at his desk at 3 in the morning, not working but simply staring at production charts, tracing the American numbers with his finger over and over, as if repetition might somehow change them. He began ending his briefings with the same phrase, "We are fighting the future, and the future has already won." His breakdown was symptomatic of a wider collapse in confidence. U-boat captains who had once fought for the privilege of dangerous patrols were now finding excuses to delay sailing. Mechanical problems that could be fixed in hours were reported as requiring weeks. Anything to avoid going back out into an ocean that had become an American lake. The shipyard workers themselves had become symbols of American power. In propaganda films that reached Germany through neutral countries, Americans saw workers like Wendy the Welder and Rosie the Riveter, women doing jobs Germans insisted were impossible for females. One intercepted newsreel showed a diminutive woman, perhaps 5 feet tall, operating a massive crane, lifting entire ship sections with the casual competence of someone arranging flowers. The German translation of her interview was suppressed, but intelligence officers knew what she'd said. "It's not hard once you get the hang of it, like baking a cake, just bigger and made of steel." The casual dismissal of difficulty, the reduction of shipbuilding to something as mundane as baking, represented a confidence that was itself a weapon. The Americans weren't struggling to match German production. They were treating it as a solved problem, something barely worth discussing. By January 1944, the evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Germany's U-boat fleet, which had peaked at 240 operational boats, was being destroyed faster than replacements could be built. But the real defeat wasn't in the numbers of submarines lost. It was in the futility of their mission. Even if every U-boat scored a perfect patrol, sinking 3 ships each, they'd destroy perhaps 700 vessels. The Americans would replace them in 3 weeks. The war at sea had become an absurd theater where one side performed elaborate attacks on an enemy that barely noticed the losses. Convoy escorts had become so numerous that U-boats often faced 10 or 12 warships for every merchant vessel they might attack. The hunters had become the hunted, and the prey had become infinite. In one of the war's most telling moments, captured documents revealed that American shipyard workers in Portland had organized a betting pool, not on whether they'd meet production targets, but by how much they'd exceed them. The winning bet for March 1944 was 7 ships over quota, placed by a 63-year-old grandmother who worked the night shift. Her prize was war bonds, which she donated back to the yard's production fund. When this story reached German intelligence, it wasn't filed. The officer who translated it destroyed it, later testifying that he couldn't bear to add one more piece of evidence to Germany's mounting defeat. Some truths were too heavy even for intelligence files. The final irony came from Hitler himself. In one of his last coherent meetings about naval warfare in March 1944, he demanded to know why American convoys weren't being stopped. When informed about the shipbuilding figures, now approaching 150 vessels per month, he flew into a rage, accusing his admirals of believing enemy propaganda. Then, in a moment of unexpected clarity, he asked, "If these figures are even half true, haven't we already lost?" The room fell silent. No one answered. No one needed to. The mathematics of defeat had already been calculated, verified, and accepted by everyone except the man who had started the war. Germany hadn't just lost the Battle of the Atlantic. It had lost it before the first torpedo was fired, the moment American industrial might was awakened and aimed at the sea. The evidence mounted beyond dispute. In May 1944, just before D-Day, Allied convoys crossed the Atlantic with such regularity that U-boat commanders reported seeing the same ships making round trips. Vessels they'd failed to sink heading east would pass them again heading west, loaded with wounded soldiers and empty supply containers, only to return eastward weeks later with fresh supplies. The ocean had become an Allied highway, with German submarines reduced to the role of hazardous potholes. Dangerous if hit directly, but incapable of stopping traffic. One U-boat commander, in his final report before his submarine was destroyed by aircraft from an escort carrier, wrote, "We are ghosts haunting an ocean that no longer belongs to us. The Americans haven't defeated us. They've simply built a new ocean on top of the old one. An ocean made of steel and filled with ships we cannot sink fast enough to matter." The human cost of this realization spread through German society like a poison. Mothers who had sent their sons to the U-boat service, once considered the elite of the Navy, now knew they were sending them to almost certain death. The loss rate for U-boat crews had reached 75%. 3 out of 4 German submariners would never come home. Meanwhile, American merchant marine casualties, while significant, were statistically minimal given the vast number of ships at sea. For every American sailor lost, 10 more were graduating from training schools. The Maritime Commission had established training centers that were producing 35,000 new merchant sailors every month. Germany's entire U-boat force numbered fewer than 40,000 men total. The Americans were producing almost an entire German Navy's worth of sailors monthly, and treating it as a minor administrative task. The administrative precision was perhaps the most demoralizing aspect for German observers. While Germany struggled with basic logistics, American shipyards had developed systems of breathtaking efficiency. They tracked every rivet, every weld, every minute of labor with scientific precision. One captured report showed that the Kaiser shipyards had calculated the optimal break schedule for workers. 15 minutes every 2 hours increased production by 12% compared to longer, less frequent breaks. They'd studied the best music to play during shifts. Up-tempo swing increased welding speed by 8%. They determined that painting ships in sections before assembly saved 46 hours per vessel. This wasn't heroic improvisation or desperate innovation. It was the methodical application of industrial science to the problem of war. Germany was fighting with courage and will. America was fighting with spreadsheets and time-motion studies. The story reached its climax in an almost anticlimactic way. By September 1944, U-Boat Command simply stopped reporting shipping tonnage sunk versus Allied production. The figures had become so lopsided that they served no purpose except to demoralize. The final report that was filed showed American shipyards launching more tonnage in a single day than U-boats were sinking in a month. But even this didn't capture the full picture. The Americans had begun canceling ship contracts, not because they couldn't build them, but because they didn't need them. Victory was so assured that production was being scaled back. Workers who had been building Liberty ships were being shifted to building landing craft for the Pacific War. The Battle of the Atlantic hadn't just been won. It had been won so thoroughly that the victors were already moving on to the next challenge. In his final days, hiding in his bunker as Berlin fell, Hitler reportedly asked Admiral Dönitz one last question about the naval war. How did they build so many so fast? Dönitz's answer, if he gave one, was never recorded. But the answer was scattered across America in shipyards that had already begun converting back to civilian production. It was in the hands of women returning to homes they'd left to weld armor plate. It was in the pride of teenagers who'd spent their high school years installing engines in destroyer escorts. It was in the systematic application of American industrial democracy to the problem of total war. Germany had brought ideology to the fight. America had brought algebra and Algebra 1. The numbers, in the end, told everything. Between 1941 and 1945, American shipyards produced 2,710 Liberty ships, 531 Victory ships, 50 aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, 48 cruisers, 349 destroyers, 498 destroyer escorts, and 203 submarines. The total tonnage exceeded 50 million tons. Germany's entire war production of naval vessels totaled less than 2 million tons. The war at sea hadn't been a battle. It had been a mathematical demonstration, a proof that industrial democracy could outproduce totalitarian efficiency by orders of magnitude. Every American worker who ever drove a rivet, welded a seam, or installed a valve had been a soldier in this war, and they'd won it not through courage or sacrifice, though there was plenty of both, but through the simple, relentless, methodical act of building. Always building. Every single day. The sound of hammers in American shipyards was louder than the guns of war, and it decided the fate of empires.